Hello and welcome everybody. This is the third and final seminar of this series of policy influencing. I will just introduce Mark. So Mark leads Prison Reform Trust External Affairs Strategy, and in cooperation with partner organisations has coordinated successful campaigns across successive governments and bills and consultations. He has extensive experience of developing strategic influencing plans, writing submissions to government and parliamentary consultations, briefings for parliamentarians, and drafting and tabling amendments. He's received advanced training in lobbying on legislation and making amendments to bills. He's provided written and oral evidence to parliamentary select committees and regularly represents PRT at external stakeholder meetings with ministers and senior officials. He has extensive experience of representing PRT in the national and local print and broadcast media, including online and social media. He regularly drafts articles, briefings, press releases, and comments. He is an experienced media spokesperson and has received professional media training. He is a member of the campaign management group for the Transition to Adulthood Alliance and clerk to the All-Party Parliamentary Penal Affairs Group. So needless to say, Mark is a mine of information on this subject. So please make use of him. We're hoping for lots of questions at the end. And we really hope that this gets you thinking about the ways in which you may be able to start to use some of his knowledge and expertise in influencing within your own work. So I will now hand over to Mark for his presentation. Thanks, Mark.
Well, thanks very much, Sophie, for that introduction. Yes, it sounded like I'd sent my CV across for, for that introduction there, but yes, you gave the gist of it. I mean, from what Sophie said, in terms of my experience, I've been the head of policy and communications now at the Prison Reform Trust for the past 10 years. So seen quite a bit in terms of not only different governments and their approach to criminal justice, but also the way in which the sector has had to respond on various issues that have come up during that time. I mean, I've spent more or less my whole career in and around policy making. So before PRT, I worked in and around think tanks in Westminster. I've worked in Parliament as well for an MP, so I got some of the kind of inside track on how Parliament works, you know, what the mindset of MPs and ministers are, which was really important, I think, for thinking about how in a role as a charity, you can influence that. And before that as well, really the thing that started my interest and career was I worked at Stonewall, the gay rights charity. Learned a lot about what a successful campaign looks like actually from that experience. So yes, you know, hopefully some of that experience will be of interest and will have informed the way in which I go about my work at the Prison Reform Trust. Before we begin on the slides, just to say quickly what I intend to do. I just want to say a little bit about the Prison Reform Trust, our role, our main areas of work, and particularly how influencing, how we go about influencing in the charity. And I want to use a particular example, which is the indeterminate sentence for public protection. Many of you will have heard about it. I will provide a little bit of background detail on the policy as well, so those who are less familiar can learn a bit, but I hope that will be a good case study looking at how PRT goes about influencing on a particular policy. What I also hope to do is to leave enough time for questions. I'm sure Sophie or Helen or Lauren will step in if I speak for too long. So I do hope we get a chance to have a discussion afterwards. But if we could start with the first slide, please, Lauren. So, yeah, this is a bit of an overview of the Prison Reform Trust and what we do. Our principal aim is to create a just, humane and effective penal system. And we do this by influencing decision makers, opinion formers in the public, around three principal aims. So they are to reduce the unnecessary use of prison, to improve treatment and conditions for prisoners, and also to promote equality and human rights in the criminal justice system. Next slide. So how do we go about that? Well, we have various strands to our work. The principal one, which I'm going to talk about today, is obviously our work around campaigning and advocacy. But we couldn't do that in isolation. The other streams of our work are absolutely vital to how we go about doing our influencing. So Sophie mentioned earlier, I am the clerk to the all-party parliamentary group on penal affairs, and the Prison Reform Trust provides the secretariat to that group. What it is essentially is a group of parliamentarians who are interested in prison reform. So it's chaired by Lord Ramsbottom, who is the former Chief Inspector of Prisons, and also co-chairing with him is Paul Maynard MP, who is a former Justice Minister in the government. And we hold regular meetings in order to discuss prison policy and matters relating to that. Last week, we actually heard from Chris Philp MP, who is a minister in the Ministry of Justice and also the Home Office as well, talking about the sentencing white paper. In addition, we commission research. That's both in-house by our head of research, Dr. Kimmet Edgar, and Dr. Mia Harris as well, who works with Kimmet. We also commission research externally, and we'll see in this example of the IPP particularly, research was a particularly important strand as to how we actually go about influencing on that issue. We also have funded programs. So the one I've highlighted there is Building Futures, which is a national lottery funded program looking at the quality of prison regimes for long sentence prisoners. And so the focus of that, it will allow us as a 5-year funded program to really develop a stream of work around a particular issue, which we consider to be of particular importance more widely to the issue of prison reform, particularly the growth of long sentence prisoners, which we've seen over the past couple of decades. We also host something called the Prisoner Policy Network, overseen by Paula Harriott. And this is a network of people who have direct experience of the justice system. And the whole point of this network is to give them a voice and to enable them to contribute directly to the processes of policy making. So we hold regular consultations through the group. We've brought members of that network in to meet with ministers and officials. And we've also used it as a base to get the message about lived experience out more widely into the sector. And certainly we've seen recently institutions such as the Prison and Probation Ombudsman, and also the Inspectorate of Probation actually bring people with lived experience directly into their organisations. So we're hoping that the network is one way in which we can contribute to that. Finally, we run an advice and information service for prisoners, mainly talking about prison rules and prisoners' entitlements under those rules. That receives about 6,000 contacts every year from people. So a widely used service and one that's absolutely crucial to our work, and also to informing us more widely about the impact of policy on the ground. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd start with just a brief overview to give some context to our discussion. This graph shows the trend in the prison population over the past 3 decades. As you can see, from around about 1995, it rose fairly rapidly, and that was right up until 2010, where we've seen more of a plateauing. And in relatively recent time, you can see at the end of the graph a dropping off of numbers. Certainly in the past year, that has been due to COVID and the seizing up of the court system. With less people coming through the system, inevitably there are less people coming into prison. But as you can see, for a charity whose aim is to reduce unnecessary imprisonment, we must acknowledge the fact that since 1995, the opposite has happened. We've seen an extraordinary growth in the prison population. Next slide, please. This just thought it was worth highlighting the women's prison population. Obviously, women's offending very different profile to men's. But again, we see a fairly rapid rise in that population from the beginning of the 90s right up until the early noughties, where we do see a levelling off. And there was a bit more focus by the Labour governments at that time around women's imprisonment and offending, which perhaps explains the slight differences in numbers there, as well as a very different profile of women's offending, a lot less women committing serious crimes and so receiving longer sentences. Again, we see a drop-off in recent years, largely due to COVID again. Next slide, please. And the other strand of PRT's work, as well as looking at numbers, is treatment and conditions. So I thought I would just highlight some quick statistics around where we're at on those particular metrics. Well, we still see a lot of prisons being of concern or serious concern, nearly 30%, according to HMPPS. We have seen some improvements in recent years, mainly due to a rise in the security scores, which HMPPS keep. But we also see that levels of assaults, deaths and self-harm remain high, and certainly historically. And also of concern is that purposeful activity and resettlement have shown a marked decline over the past decade. Now, certainly on purposeful activity, that decline will have been extraordinary in the past year because of COVID. And as well, we would expect that to have had a significant impact on many other areas of treatment and conditions as well. And that's one thing that PRT has been trying to document and track over the past year. I thought it was just worth mentioning overcrowding as well. I mean, we have a chronically overcrowded prison system, and it's been overcrowded each year since 1994. Despite high levels of prison building over that time, overcrowding has remained more or less the same. Certainly, it's remained broadly unchanged for the last 16 years. Next slide, please. So what does this say about the success overall of the criminal justice sector at influencing? Well, I think if you looked at the headline figures, I think you'd conclude that it hadn't actually been very successful at all. In many respects, certainly on numbers, we've seen things go in the opposite direction to certainly what PRT's principal aims are, and the aims of many other charities working in the sector as well. I mean, what do we conclude from that? We could conclude, and there'd be a perfectly legitimate point to raise, that perhaps the sector hasn't been very successful and it could raise its game and do better. I mean, I certainly think there are many aspects of the way in which we work which could be improved. But I think we also have to acknowledge some of the very real barriers to progress in our sector, which in some respects are different to other areas of social policy. And I've just highlighted some there. Penal populism. I mean, this is a well documented by academics working in criminology around how prison is often used by, certainly since the mid-90s, for political purposes. So starting with Michael Howard's Prison Works philosophy, really that charged much of political rhetoric and indeed policy around prisons since that time. And I would see it as a trend which has essentially kind of progressed and receded according to different political stripes of government, but it's never really gone away. It's been something that has continued to drive policymaking in our area. Related, of course, is the tabloid media and public opinion as well. We, as a sector, we must acknowledge public opinion is fairly punitive and continues to be. In fact, the opinion polling shows a pretty consistent level of punitiveness from the public over the past few decades, which must be a factor in how policy is developed in this area. Although obviously governments have they have the choice as to whether to pander to that or not. And social inequalities as well. Often areas such as prison reform are seen as sort of wicked problems which are very difficult to solve, and a lot of the problems are very far-reaching. So there are significant barriers to actual progress in this area. I mean, what has this meant in practice? Certainly over the past 10 years I've been at PRT, I would say that the majority of my work has involved firefighting. And what that means is making bad policy less bad than it might have been. That might be a depressing conclusion to draw, but I think it's undeniably true. I think one of the impacts that we probably see from our sector and what we've achieved is that things aren't as bad as they might have been if governments hadn't been picked up on various detail of policy and their potential consequences. And that's an important contribution that I think the sector's made, and it shouldn't be overlooked, actually. I think that is a really important part of its role. And often I think our successes have been a bit more below the radar than necessarily in the headlines. You will see success in the detail of operational policy, the way we've worked with officials, as I said, to interpret the headline measures and make them workable, or at least have less of a damaging impact than they might have been. Next slide, please. So PRT's approach. I've listed 5 strands there, which I think characterize how we choose to go about influencing. This phrase critical friend, I think it's come up before in these series, but it's an important one. It's sometimes a challenging relationship to have, but it's an important way of operating. It's about saying to government that, look, we want you to succeed in your ambitions, but we're going to be clear about what we think you might be doing wrong if we have to say so. And it's also with officials, I think. It's providing that sounding board when they have to go about implementing policy, to have people they can go to have a relatively open conversation about the impact of policy is important. But it's also a challenging dynamic, and it is one that can mean that sometimes people might claim that we're more on the inside than they would like us to be. I mean, we would say it is the most effective way of achieving change, but obviously there are other organisations who would take a different approach, and I think that's entirely legitimate, and indeed there's room for many different approaches in our sector. Behind that, I think crucially lies the issue of independence. We don't take government money. We're fortunate to be in a position to do that. I know that many aren't, but what it does allow us to do is to have a platform where we can speak from a position of independence and not ultimately knowing that government may seek to withdraw our funding if we were too critical. So as I said, we are very fortunate to have that, but it does allow us to be more independent in our advocacy. I mentioned the importance of research and evidence before. I won't dwell on that because we've got a few slides to get through, but that's absolutely crucial to how we go about our influencing. I mentioned the Prisoner Policy Network too, and the Advice and Information Service, an absolutely vital strand of evidence into our influencing by allowing us to provide a voice for prisoners. And finally, principled opportunism. What we mean by that is, when you're seeking to influence, you have to be responsive to the wider context and the challenges and opportunities which that context provides. If we weren't, then we wouldn't be able to advance in certain areas over others. So we need to be responsive. But at the same time, we're guided by our principles, and the principles were the ones I mentioned earlier. So in everything we do, we seek to implement those principles, but we inevitably have to respond to the changing context which we're operating in. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell on these for too long because I actually want to get to the example, but these are our various tools about how we would go about influencing. So there are programs of research and activity. Membership of advisory groups, they're important, such as the Advisory Board on Female Offenders, the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody. We have formal membership of those, and that does allow us to have a continuous presence with government and regular meetings with officials. The other ones I've listed there are sort of the more day-to-day tools which we would use around monitoring for consultations that are coming up and developments, responding to those, working with officials behind the scenes, working in Parliament when the opportunity arises, working as part of wider coalitions. So we're just one group in a much wider sector, and sometimes we can have the biggest impact by working together. And of course, working with the media when we feel there is an issue that needs rising public attention and awareness. So yes, we will use sometimes all of those, sometimes just one or two, depending upon the policy issue which we're seeking to get change on. Next slide, please. And these are just some of PRT's campaigns. I've listed them under our aims so that you can see how they might relate. I've got IPPs there. I'll talk about that in more detail. Obviously, at the other end of the scale is women, because their offending is largely less serious. We're talking about short sentences there. So really looking at how we would reduce the use of short sentences, as well as looking at policies such as more effective community intervention, liaison and diversion services, so that women aren't drawn into the criminal justice system in the first place. Improving conditions for prisoners. A lot of that is around work with officials on policy. So things such as release on temporary license, use of information and communication technology in prison. These are all issues on which we have intervened on, either through programs of research or indeed direct lobbying on the policies as and when they've arisen. Equality and human rights, just some examples there of issues which are particularly touched on equality and human rights. So PAVA, use of force, disproportionate impact on BANE prisoners. Similarly, knife crime prevention orders, netting in a lot of young Black men in particular into those orders. And we did a lot of lobbying work around that when it was introduced in Parliament to try and limit the damage which that could have potentially caused. And liaison and diversion services. I mentioned this because this is, I think, one example of a more positive development in the criminal justice system, which has been the steady increase in liaison and diversion services at police stations and courts over the past decade or so. Now seeing, I think, nearly 100% coverage in England and Wales, although obviously there will be wrinkles in how those are delivered in practice, but definitely an advance on that. And through Lord Bradley being one of our trustees, through the dogged work of my former colleague, Jenny Talbot, I would say that PRT's work was an important influence on that programme and how it was developed and evolved. Next slide, please. So I want to start the second part of the presentation by talking about an example, and particularly how PRT went about lobbying on a particular policy, which was the indeterminate sentence for public protection. Now, it is a fairly complicated policy and also a complicated set of recommendations which we have come up with. So in order to sort of help people understand that, I thought it was worth just providing a bit of detail. So the IPP, it was established by the Criminal Justice Act 2003, enacted in 2005. It was a form of indeterminate sentence like a life sentence. So it has a minimum tariff which someone has to serve in prison. Release is determined by the Parole Board, again, like a life sentence. If someone is authorised for release, there's an indefinite period on licence, which can be reviewed after 10 years. And it was originally, it could be given to an offender who'd committed one or more of a large number of sexual or violent offences, which was specified in the 2003 Criminal Justice Act. It was also originally mandated for a second listed offence, which was meant that if someone had committed an offence, a listed offence twice, the judge had to impose an IPP sentence. Next slide, please. Now, fairly shortly after the introduction of the sentence, concerns began to emerge. One was that it was too broad, and it was catching up a lot of less serious as well as more serious offenders in its net. As we'll see in a couple of slides later, it contributed to a massive growth in the number of indeterminate sentence prisoners in prison, putting severe strain on the prison and parole systems. Because of this, and they simply hadn't planned for the resources necessary to administer the sentence, this led to significant delays in prisoners getting access to offending behaviour programmes, as well as delays in getting parole hearings as well. This led to increased uncertainty, understandably, amongst IPP prisoners and their families, and a growing sense of injustice around the sentence. And IPP numbers as well led to overcrowding in prisons. It was one of the main factors actually which led to the rise in the prison population over that period. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the problems had emerged fairly quickly, and it became evident even to the government, who actually moved in 2008 to change the sentence so that they got rid of the necessity of it having to be imposed for a second offence. And they also introduced a minimum tariff of 2 years for the sentence. Before that, it could have been imposed. You know, some people we know of got tariffs of just a few months and are still inside, actually, decades later. Next slide, please. In 2010, PRT published a research report called Unjust Deserts by the academics Mike Huff and Jessica Jacobson. This looked at the impact of the sentence on the criminal justice system overall, right through from the courts through to prisons and resettlement. It was one of the at the time, the Lord Chief Justice actually passed it on to the Justice Secretary, Ken Clarke, and it was one of the streams of evidence which ultimately led to the decision to abolish the sentence in 2012. Next slide, please. And indeed, this was the act which abolished the sentence, but crucially, that abolition was not retrospective. So whilst from a certain point after enactment, an IPP could no longer be passed on someone, there was still a population in prison who was subject to the IPP and also subject to it when they were released from custody. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide detailing the legacy of the IPP. There are still nearly 2,000 people in prison serving an IPP. Nearly 9 in 10 of those are still in prison despite having already served their tariff length, which, as I said, is the minimum period people must spend in custody. 1 in 6 people who have yet to be released have a tariff of less than 2 years. So that means they have now spent a significant period of years over tariff still in prison. Indeed, 300 people were given a tariff of less than 2 years, but they're still in prison. And we have a further 1,357 people who are back in prison, having previously been released, so recalled back to prison. And that's a figure which continues to rise. Next slide, please. And these are just some graphics which illustrate some of those trends. So we can see here the growth in the indeterminate sentence prison population, and it's the blue graph, which is the IPP population. And as we can see, from 2012, when the sentence was abolished, we see a steady decline in the IPP population. But as we can see from 2018, where I think they begin to disaggregate the figures, you can see that seems to be rising or plateauing again. And what that shows is the number of IPPs who have been recalled back to prison having been released. So we see between 2015 to 17, some success by the system at releasing people on IPPs, but now we're seeing an emerging and growing problem of people being recalled back once they have been released. Next slide. And this just shows that in more detail. This shows the rising recall population, the IPP recall population in prison since 2015. As we can see, quite an extraordinary rise in numbers since that time. Next slide, please. And this is a graph showing rates of release and rates of recall. As you can see, a rise in the release rate from 2015 to around about 2017, then it sort of plateaus a bit. And now we see the release rate declining. At the same time, we've seen a steady rise in the recall rate. They both have fallen recently. Again, COVID has been a factor in that. But yes, still a situation where we've seen those two trends essentially come together. Next slide, please. And finally, this I mentioned what is the impact of the IPP. We can see this partly in the rate of self-harm for this group. As you can see, it is, apologies, the labels aren't quite clear here, but the blue figure is for determinate sentence prisoners. The yellow is for life sentence prisoners, and the red figure is the rate of the self-harm rate for IPPs. You can see it's more than double that for determinate sentence prisoners. So significant level of distress amongst this population compared to other groups. Next slide, please. So what has PRT sought to do about this? Well, I mentioned our previous work in 2010, the research report. We obviously have a new situation now, which is a sentence which has been abolished, but where we still have a large population in prison subject to it. So our strategy organized around these three principles, and hopefully you will understand why we came to these points as I speak. Convert, and that's to convert ultimately all IPPs into their equivalent determinate sentence. To protect, so that's to protect the public by ensuring that there is a minimum period of license subject to all IPPs, but which can be worked through. And finally, rehabilitate, to ensure that sufficient resource is given to enable IPPs to rehabilitate not only in prison so that they can gain release, but also to make a success of their release when they are returned to the community. Next slide, please. What were the assumptions behind this strategy? Well, as I hope you've sort of gathered from my explanation, what we're faced with is a complex problem. It's a problem that's going to require change at a number of levels, not only legislative, and ultimately the only solution is legislative, which would be a retrospective abolition of the sentence. There are other legislative options which can be pursued as well, and I'll come on to speak about those, but also at operational levels too. If we weren't to achieve legislative change, there are also operational changes which could be made around the management and supervision of this group in the community, as well as how their risk is assessed in prison too. We concluded that progress requires buy-in from senior officials. As a result, a campaigning approach is unlikely to be effective. In order to make progress, we need to be working with those people on the inside that know and understand the problem and are making efforts in order to improve it. Now, this is always a challenge for charities involved in lobbying work. Understandably, many of our supporters want to see us on the barricades, highlighting the injustice which the IPP absolutely does lead to, and being vocal about it, and going to the press, etc., is a very important strand of how we would go about seeking to achieve change. But ultimately, in order to succeed, we also need to ensure that those senior officials and indeed sympathetic ministers are on side and they can see the benefits themselves of making change in this area. Similarly, we concluded that progress most likely to be on the basis of cross-party consensus and support, particularly because the IPP was introduced by a Labour government, it was abolished by a coalition government, but there are concerns and indeed different views on all sides about how you go about unwinding the sentence. So one of our tasks is to ensure that the issue doesn't become party political, but we actually find a way of gaining progress on a cross-party basis. Next slide, please. So from those set of assumptions, PRT developed an approach. We thought this approach needed to be research-led. This was to build an evidence base for change. As I said, we thought an important strand would be to be working closely with senior officials and practitioners. Careful work in the media to highlight the impact of the IPP on prisoners and their families. That also involves work with IPP prisoners and their families themselves. And I'll come on to show how our work went about doing that. And also to develop that cross-party support, which we felt was crucial to achieving change in this area. Next slide, please. So we commissioned 2 pieces of research. One was a piece by Dr. Harry Annison at Southampton University, looking at the contribution families make to successful resettlement of IPP prisoners. More recently, we've just published research on the reasons why IPP prisoners are recalled and how they can be supported to make a success of their release on licence. And that was led by our head of research, Kim Edgar, along with Mia Harris and also Russell Webster. Next slide, please. This is just an example of one of the outcomes from the research that was conducted by Dr. Annison. He worked very closely with the people who he initially involved in the research itself. So that was families, but also some of the statutory agencies, including the Parole Board. And out of that work, the Parole Board actually went on to develop guidance for families about how it responded to IPPs, sentenced prisoners, amongst others. One of the reasons for that guidance is one of the findings of the research was just this level of distress and lack of knowledge and understanding which families had about the parole process and what to expect. So improved guidance was felt as one of the ways to meet that concern. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we thought a key part of the strategy was that it had to be research-led. And our research on IPP recalls, by interviewing people on an IPP who had been recalled, as well as by looking at some of the quantitative data. We actually had new data released to us by the prison service. We were able to draw out some quite granular findings about, what was people's experience of the recall process, which, as I said earlier, is really the growing problem in the IPP, the numbers of people who are being recalled. And here I just thought you'd be interested to see some of the key findings from that report. I won't read them out, but the key thing is that clearly this was a system which was in need of improvement. As we say below, not all IPP prisoners experienced all of these issues, but they were common enough to reveal a system in need of radical change. Next slide, please. And that enabled us to develop some fairly detailed recommendations about what we think government should do. And I will read these out because it's important thinking about how, what we are therefore seeking to influence. A reduction in the length of time before which people are entitled to have their licence reviewed from 10 to 5 years, with a yearly review after that period. Changes to the recall test and process for IPP prisoners, so they're not at risk of more severe punishment for their behaviour than would otherwise justify. The final recommendation was perhaps the most radical option, which is a process of judge-led reviews for all individual IPP cases, along with a phased programme of release. In addition, all IPP prisoners should have a fixed date on which their liability to recall ends. Now, the importance of that recommendation is, obviously, that is the recommendation for abolition, but someone who, well, I don't like to say opponents because I don't think that type of language helps. People who would argue against us would say, well, what about those small group of IPP prisoners who are a genuine risk and danger? And if the IPP hadn't been in place, would have received a discretionary life sentence. And undoubtedly, amongst the IPP population, there will be a small group who would have got that. And obviously, this underlying this concern is one around public protection. We had to have an answer to that question. And it was only by going through our detailed research that we were able to, as well as just quite a lot of thinking about the issue, that we were able to develop an answer to that. And the answer is essentially a resentencing exercise of each individual. Undeniably time-consuming, undeniably expensive, but as far as we can see, it is really the only realistic policy option for how you would ultimately unwind the IPP sentence. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we didn't think that the IPP was amenable to a kind of campaigning approach. But what the research did enable us to do through generating those findings and recommendations, it's generating a platform upon which we can seek increased public awareness and understanding. But it's on the basis of a fully informed argument based on the evidence. So these are just some examples of the coverage which our IPP report on recalls got. We did an exclusive with the BBC Radio 4 Today programme. Unfortunately, that broadcast isn't available anymore, but that was the tweet which the journalist, who we've worked with over a number of years now, who has done consistent series of excellent reports on IPPs, she covered the report for us. And The Guardian also covered it. Again, what you'll see there is it doesn't really look like a piece about a research report. We got Lord Brown, who is a former justice in the Supreme Court, to write the foreword for the report. Because of his profile and backgrounds and authority, that was picked up in the press. And again, those types of decisions about who do you get to champion are really quite important to how you then go about influencing. Lord Brown, respected crossbencher, former judge. It has clout. So yes, these are just some examples of the coverage we got. Next slide, please. This is an example of coverage. I'll just defer to Sophie here. I'm very happy to play it if people are interested, but if we're struggling for time, I'm happy to skip. Sophie?
We're fine for time, I think. So if you want to play it, it's only 2 minutes long. So yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, that would be great.
Lost his wrist, he burned his tattoo off his body. A couple of times he's burned himself.
April Ward is talking about her brother James. In 2006, he was given a 10-month prison sentence. 10 years later, he is still inside. He has no release date.
He's just going round and round in circles.
Over the last few months, James Ward, who is now 31, has written to the Today programme to tell us about his life inside prison.
I find prison hard to cope with, being trapped in a box. I know my family are amazing and they want me out of prison. I have to do something to get myself out. I owe it as much to them as to myself. I'm sorry, I feel really fed up.
As a teenager, James was in and out of trouble with the police, and his family couldn't cope with his behaviour. One day he got into a fight with his father Bill over the family dog.
I'm Mr. Ward, James Ward's dad. I bent down to pick the dog up, and as I bent down, it kicked me straight in the face. I don't think he realised what he'd done, because I was covered in blood.
That assault led to James being sent to prison for a year. He struggled to cope. Close to the end of his sentence, he set fire to the mattress in his cell. For doing this, a judge gave him an IPP, or imprisonment for public protection, and said he should serve a minimum of 10 months. Some people listening might say, he must be in prison because he deserves to be in prison. He must be a danger to the public.
No, he's not. Not a danger to the public. No, but he won't hurt anybody. All he's doing is hurting himself.
James has a low IQ and has suffered from mental health problems throughout his sentence. As he explained in one of his letters to us, he receives medication for attention deficit disorder.
I get my meds for ADHD every morning, which do help me, but prison's not fit to accommodate people like me with mental health problems. It's made me worse. How can I change in a place like this? I wake up every morning scared of what the day might hold.
Okay. It may have just cut off, but I think we've probably heard enough for you to get a flavour of, how the media has covered this, the importance of working with a trusted journalist, and also I think here, this wasn't actually a broadcast we worked directly with Zoe on. James was a case study that she herself had been following and she has been following for a number of years. But what it shows is the importance of stories and having the individual voice, bringing the issue to life. Absolutely crucial if you want to make progress on any issue, and trying to develop out of a complex issue, public sympathy and understanding. Again, not easy with an issue like IPPs, but such as obviously looking at the consequences on the individual's mental health, the anguish of the families. These are ways in which you can really bring home the impact of what is quite a complex policy to understand. Next slide, please. Working alongside insiders. As I said, absolutely crucial. There is no hope of getting any change in this area if we're not also supporting and working alongside people on the inside who are trying to improve the system. In November 2016, one thing that the PRT did was we issued an FOI to the Parole Board asking for it to disclose the board's advice to the Justice Secretary on policy options for expediting the release of IPPs. We kind of knew this was, we knew it was there, but it hadn't been made public. So by making public the options which we know had been given to the Secretary of State, it was a way of trying to lever up change. And these were the policy options which the Parole Board had outlined to the Minister. It's important to say that this was impartial advice given to the Minister on his request. It wasn't recommendations made by the Parole Board. These are simply policy options they produced. But these have informed how we then went about coming up with our own recommendations for how we think the sentence should be unwound. And as you can see, some familiar words there: conversion, change the recall test, change the license period. These are part of the policy changes which we are seeking. Next slide, please. And as we saw in these slides, between 2015 and 2017-18, there had been an improvement in the rate of release of IPP prisoners. And that was undeniably, again, due to the efforts of the Parole Board, but also more widely the prison service to seek to expedite the release of the remaining IPP population. So the strategy the Parole Board itself had were around reducing the backlog of oral hearings, less focus on determinate recall cases, and improving readiness for release and release planning as well. Again, absolutely important for achieving any progress in this area. You know, there had to be people on the inside recognizing that there were a problem and prepared to put in place operational changes to do something about it. Obviously, the Parole Board and Prison Service have to operate within the statutory framework set by government and Parliament. So, so there's only so much they can do within their remit. But undeniably, some of the efforts which were taken have led to improvements. Although now what we are faced with, as I said, is a different problem, which is dealing with people who have been recalled, not really covered by this strategy. So, so there's now a need for a renewed look about how we deal with the recall of IPP prisoners. Next slide, please. I mentioned the importance of developing a cross-party approach. This is a sensitive issue. Different politicians have had different views on it. So Sadiq Khan, when he was the Shadow Justice Secretary, was opposed to the abolition of the IPP. Labour is now saying rather different things, but their support for change is not certain by any means. So part of our job is to bring down the political temperature, to not make this a political issue, to make this an issue upon which politicians can agree there needs to be change. How do we go about this? Well, it's difficult. But as I said, having research, having evidence is one way of convincing politicians of points which aren't then therefore ultimately rooted in politics, but are rooted in evidence of what is happening on the ground. We also sought to develop a cross-party approach and indeed achieve change through drafting and tabling amendments to the Prison and Courts Bill, which was introduced in 2016. Unfortunately, that bill fell fairly quickly as a result of the 2017 general election. But we are hoping again to use the forthcoming sentencing bill, which we expect to be introduced at the beginning of March this year, as an opportunity to table amendments to seek to follow through on the recommendations which we've made. Next slide, please. So you'll be pleased to know this is my last slide, and it's perhaps briefer than it should be, but I just wanted to conclude by drawing out what I think are some of the lessons around how you go about campaigning. Now, I've only really had time to dwell on one issue, which is the IPP. We can perhaps talk about this in more detail in the questions. Depending on the issue, you would adopt different approaches. But I think that these are fairly, these are fairly important points which can be applied across any type of campaign. So it's to be clear about the problem you have and identify what you think the solution is to that problem. The importance of evidencing your arguments. So, I've had countless officials say to me, yes, but where's the evidence for what you're advocating? They won't believe you unless you're able to show, the evidence behind your arguments. Think about your audience. What would your worst enemy say? What I mean there is it's sometimes helpful to step outside your comfort zone and think about not just what the sector says, but what does someone outside the sector think? So in relation to the IPP, wholesale conversion and abolition of the sentence, that's likely to be scary to a lot of people, including to people in the Ministry of Justice and people in Parliament. Are there other ways in which we can start talking about this, or recommendations which we could make, which they might be more sympathetic to? So what about giving people a fair chance to make the best of their sentence and ultimately to resettle? If we think about the way in which we frame the problem, that's really important for how it's received and the likelihood of it getting a fair hearing. Finally, don't be blown off course. There are plenty of people when you're conducting a campaign on an issue who will tell you otherwise, who will tell you they have a better idea of how to do it and to go about it. You have to stick to your principles, I think, and be clear about why you have embarked on a particular approach. Now, that's not to mean that you shouldn't be open to change, and you should indeed be evaluating your approach as it goes along and considering its success. But if you have based your approach on a clear analysis, then be careful about changing it, unless there are facts on the ground which have changed, which require a change in the strategy. Because otherwise what you end up is with a strategy that will quickly fall apart. Anyway, I think I shall leave it there because I want to leave time for questions. So Sophie, if I could hand over to you.
Sure. Oh, well, thank you, Mark, for such a thorough and interesting presentation. It's so interesting to hear your insights about the different approaches, you know, and getting that cross-party support and building coalitions and everything that you've said. It was, really interesting. And I'm sure everyone will have enjoyed listening to the work that you've put in on the IPP sentences, myself particularly, because it's an issue close to my heart as well. I can't believe that the Unjust Deserts document was 2010, because I actually remember reading that at the time. So anyway, I'll stop talking because we've got lots of questions that have come in whilst you've been talking. So if it's all right, could I come to Catherine Wakefield first? Oh, can I just say sorry for apologise for the binging sounds. I hope that wasn't too distracting, Mark. I think it's noise coming through from someone's computer, so apologies.
Probably, unfortunately, I think it's mine.
Oh, that's
so
okay.
Apologies for that.
Oh, that's all right. I didn't want you to be distracted. So yeah, sorry. Hi, Catherine. I think you had a question for Mark.
Yes, sorry. I'm just trying to remember what it actually was, because since then a lot have been popped down in the chat. So
it was about ageing population, I think.
Yeah, it was just to sort of understand the graph at the start of the presentation a little bit more, just because you explained later on in the presentation that IPP have contributed to that rise in the prison population. So I just wondered how the ageing population has kind of like impacted on that rise, and maybe it's not so much that well, I just wondered like whether it's sort of less about more prison sentences being given out and more just that people are kind of bed blocking, so to speak. When people talk about hospital, it's just that people are getting older.
Well, we definitely have an aging prison population, and obviously that's mirrored in a sort of aging population overall in the community, which completely understand your point that a common sense view might be, well, isn't the prison population simply reflecting the changing demographics on the outside? I mean, I'll defer to the Ministry of Justice analysts and who do the story of the prison population document, which I would recommend to everyone here who's interested. What that does is it outlines what have been the key drivers of the prison population over the last few decades. And its conclusion is that overwhelmingly, it's been the growth in long sentences which have been passed, which have contributed to the rise. I mean, that is related to the aging population, because obviously people are literally growing older in prison because they're serving a long sentence. But the conclusion of the MOJ, the conclusion of the Sentencing Council as well, is that it's the growth in longer sentences which has been the main contributor.
Growth in longer sentences being given, as opposed to the fact that there are longer sentences that were given, people have gotten older and therefore are still there, kind of thing.
Well, so to use an example, the 2003 Criminal Justice Act changed the minimum tariff length for murder, for various types of murder, and subsequently that had a knock-on effect through Court of Appeal judgments on the length of sentences for other types of offence as well, because there was a sort of adjustment exercise which went on. And this had the impact of increasing sentence lengths overall for a range of serious crimes. there's a guy called Savas Hadjipoulos who runs a consultancy called Justice Episteme, and he's a bit of a wizard at number crunching. He used to work at the MOJ himself, and he ran a program which estimated that if the 2003 Criminal Justice Act hadn't been passed, the prison population today would be 17,000 less than it is. So that's a direct result of the legislative changes which were introduced as a result of that act.
Right. And what was that MOJ paper you referenced at this?
It's the story of the prison population. It's a really good document that outlines all of the different drivers to the prison population. I mean, it's not just growth in long sentences which have contributed. There are other factors as well. But undeniably, that is, one of the most important, if not the most important factor.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so the other question I have is from Steve Girling, which I'm going to ask on his behalf. In fact, he asked two, but we've got lots coming in, so I'm just going to pick one. And his question was, how can you ensure that publications don't put their own spin on a piece? A poor headline can immediately give the wrong assumption. So have you got any advice?
So I'm guessing this means how the media receives research. I mean, so my experience of working with the media is that that it's interesting. Actually, a lot of journalists on publications who you might think are not sympathetic, I've actually come to respect, and they do. The overwhelming number of journalists, even on publications who you might not think are our friend, are trying to be good journalists. So they don't want to report inaccuracies or lies. They want to try and report the truth, but they also have an editor and they have sub-editors who try and market their pieces in the way that they think their readers will want to receive them. So it's often at the level of the headline where things go wrong, because it's how the piece is actually spun and for its audience rather than the substance itself. So even if you read, say, a piece in the Daily Mail on criminal justice, you will find that it strives to be accurate on the whole, and the problem often isn't in the substance; it's in the headline. Now, there's not that much you can do about the headline, in all honesty. You can write a press release which you seek to guide the journalists to the conclusion you want them to draw. I mean, the other thing is that journalists are extremely time poor. So more often than not, if they read a press release, they think it's an accurate representation of your report. They will go along with the line you put, but they may not. They may decide there's a different story in your report. So you can never entirely guarantee it, but one way of doing it is just developing an instinct and sense of what journalists are looking for. And when you have that, you can tailor what you're saying to them and what you're giving to them in a way that you think they'll be receptive to. So yeah, it's a sometimes risky game because you never quite know, but there are ways of doing it.
Brilliant, thanks, Mark. So can I come to another Steve, Steve Kirkman? Sorry, I don't know if you're there to ask your question in person.
It was, yeah, sorry, I missed part of that. Hi, welcome. Thanks for both of you, really informative session. Very factual, very emotionally moving, I have to say. Listening to the radio, there was news yesterday about a push for 500 more places for women prisoners. My point being that if you build 100 prisons, you'll just fill them. So how on earth do we put an argument against that?
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a relatively recent development. And in all honesty, as I said, the Prison Reform Trust is a member of the Advisory Board on Female Offenders. along with a number of other charities, and there has been some concern raised about this announcement and how it happened and the level of consultation with the sector on it. So it's in all honesty, this is we are ourselves responding to this. It was unexpected, and obviously extremely unwelcome, because the government published a strategy in 2018 on female offenders. One of the key strands of that strategy was to reduce the female prison population, and yet we had the announcement on Saturday saying that they were working on the assumption that there would be a rise in the female prison population, and therefore they're going to build an extra 500 places. I don't really have an answer, because it's, as I said, it's early days and
work in progress.
There is genuine concern about how this happened, and so the sector is still, I think, at a relatively early stage of deciding on its response.
Thanks, Mark. Helen raised this question, but also John Green said he echoed it. John, I don't know if you're there, if you want to ask a question, or if you'd prefer me to.
I think there are two of us have booked in on my invitation. It might just be that it's Carol, the chief exec, who's come in and asked that question. She's the other John Green. I suspect we've both come in on the same invitation.
Ah, right. That's the comment about having your account hacked.
So
I thought you were just referencing that there were more than two Johns.
I thought there was until I saw it. She's the better looking John Green.
I am here, Sophie, so I'm happy to pick that one up. But yeah, I mean, influencing policy, there are so many of us working as charities within criminal justice sectors. I mean, I myself have a background of working at one of the local prisons, but we deliver services from magistrates' courts now. So my question really echoed Helen's, really, in that we're so limited, I think, in being able to get that voice to where we'd like it to go. So I think just understanding what our best approach in our localities might be. I mean, we do a lot of hard work around working in partnerships and also subscribing to people like Clinks, you know, and various other bodies. But for 16 years, I think we're still kind of trying to get our message through, and there are always different themes that come through Ministry of Justice and through government. So just some advice from Mark, really, about how to start the ball rolling when we're small and we feel like a bit of a lone voice.
Yeah, so just to help you, Mark, Helen's question was, so for smaller organisations with little capacity, what's the best way to influence?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just for those smaller charities.
Well, I come from it from a position of humility, really. I mean, I'm very lucky. I'm paid to do what I do, and I don't have any other job to do. And I know that, you know, people working in charities across the country on the ground are doing much more important work than me, delivering services, ensuring that that there is a certain standard of care for people in prison and on release. And obviously kind of campaigning and advocacy has to take place around that. And that's not something I'm faced with. So I'm sort of hesitant to give advice when I know that, you know, people are working so much harder than me on other areas. And I suppose what I would say is that, you know, PRT, we seek to influence at the national level, but our reach locally isn't one of our strong points, I would say. You know, we're a London-based charity. We have access to the ministry and Parliament and the prison service. But in terms of what's going on around the country on the ground, it's harder for us. And I think one of the strengths of people located elsewhere is they will know the networks of decision makers who are in a position to make changes at that local level. And I suppose just to use an example like Manchester, you know, Manchester, independently of national government, have developed a whole system approach to women's offending. And that has happened through cooperation between local government leaders, services, statutory agencies, but it's all been very much local. It's all been determined locally. So I would say perhaps one way of doing it is to focus on those people you already know and are already in contact with and are already in a position to make change. I mean, the other way to be networked in more widely into lobbying at the national level is to, I would say, to be part of umbrella groups like Clinks and like the Criminal Justice Alliance, because they should be, they are forums where, they rely upon the evidence from their members in order to make the cases they need to make to government. So I think that being able to feed into those bodies with, I mean, I think one of the things often is evidence, good evidence. If you've got good evidence of a service that works or of a problem, that's going to be more persuasive than anything else. So being able to feed in robust evidence is one way of doing it. And as I said, the other I think would be, is to remember how you're in a position of strength when it comes to changes at the local level.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, I'd just like to add, obviously the Stronger Voice project is, part of these sessions. We're going to build on them with a wider programme to help those smaller and more specialist organisations, in kind of having influence, getting their voice heard. So again, look out in Light Lunch because there will be more information coming out. So can I move on to Kismet, if you're there, if you want to ask your question, if you're still there, otherwise I can.
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Hiya.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for putting this on, because it's really informative for me. I'm being a bit cheeky because just out of the conversation, so my initial question was actually regarding the 51% within YOIs, and how we could better support them or measure that support. But equally, I'm really interested within the stat around BAME people, and just from the conversation, I'm thinking how many BAME people fall under the IPP sentences and how many of them sort of get recalled. I just find it really interesting, and if there's a way that we can do further research, or if the research is there and I can look into it, that would be amazing.
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, I'm afraid, but I can certainly look into it for you. But I mean, undeniably, more generally, the issue of disproportionality in prisons is a serious one. It's one that PRT has been concerned about. We've done quite a bit of work around violence, particularly use of force in prisons, which disproportionately is used against BAME people. And I mean, the particular concern we've had recently is around the rollout of Parva spray, which even the early analysis of the pilot shows has had a disproportionate impact on BAME offenders, as we'd expect with a disproportionate use of force overall. We're also launching tomorrow our Bromley Briefing prison fact file.
Okay.
You will see when that's launched that the key focus of that is on the issue of BAME disproportionality in prisons. We've commissioned a piece by an expert on the issue, which we've led on in terms of our press work. So it's an issue which is of serious concern. The government's proposals in the white paper are going to make it worse, and it's one which we want to make a priority for our work going forward, along with the rest of the sector. But I'll be happy to find out about the specific issue in relation to IPPs and get back to you.
Yeah, that would be amazing, because I think they're just with the amount of craziness going on, it would be really helpful to sort of dig out the actual stats and raise awareness on it. Sorry for taking up just another minute. How could we better sort of measure the support within YOIs?
What do you mean exactly?
So just in general, for instance, when people are out on release or whatever, the organisations that are there, whether they're grassroots or not, it seems like the young people are not getting the support that they need in terms of like, you know, at least having a mentor to sort of support them throughout, and they end up being recalled quite often. And it is quite a high percentage of young people, and a lot of them are care leavers as well. Me being a care leaver myself, I just find it really, I mean, there's no support within the housing system. So it's just, how can we sort of raise awareness, or, you know, is there any better practices that we can say, you know, to go to some of these institutions and say, why don't you follow this practice? I don't know if I'm making sense or going off on a tangent, but...
No, thanks for your question. I mean, it's a really important issue. I'm going to take the coward's way out and defer to my colleague, John Drew, who is, youth justice is an expert area, and it's not my area of expertise. So John Drew, who's a former chief exec of the YJB, leads on this work for us. So I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. The other organisation I'd recommend is the Standing Committee for Youth Justice.
Okay.
And Pippa Goodfellow is the director there, and again is an expert on issues around youth justice. So I would recommend talking to her. But I won't answer on your specific question, because in all honesty, I don't have the knowledge of that sector.
No, thank you for your honesty, and it is completely fine. I appreciate everything so far, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So yeah, I'm just collating the last ones. I think there's a few popping up. So I didn't know if Melanie Jameson, whether you wanted to ask a question, if you're still there.
Yeah, I am here. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Trying to unmute. I was just desperately picking up a point, looking at a document that I sent through on 10 ways of getting through to government. As a dyslexia specialist in the criminal justice system, we work with Lord Addington, and what he always says is that parliamentarians like to know the solutions to problems. So be aware of what the government policy is, linked to it, even somewhat sideways, and kind of give them a solution. And he said the other thing they absolutely hate is if the sector seems to be contradictory. So speaking with one voice is important. But my actual question was, has the PRT tried to work with the chair of the Justice Committee? Because I find I always listen to the Justice Select Committee sessions, and I find that they're very thorough, the way they can call anybody and ask anything. So that's my actual question, and I'll just type the other thing in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melanie.
Yes, thanks, Melanie. First of all, I think Lord Addington is absolutely right. I think those 2 points are ones I've heard before as well, and it's good advice for anyone looking to lobby Parliament. You know, talk about solutions, not just about problems. And you know, I do think that when sectors are not united on basic points and argue amongst themselves, it can be a real turn off for policymakers who you know, from their perspective, why would they listen to the sector if it can't decide itself what it wants? So it is important that you have a sort of relatively united front, although there will be variation in what people think within that. Your question was about the Justice Committee. Yes, absolutely. We regularly submit evidence to the inquiries which the committee holds, and we've given oral evidence as well. In fact, I've given oral evidence to the committee on, I can't remember what the inquiry was, but it's a committee which we're regularly in touch with. We've met with Bob Neal previously. We've met with other members of the committee. We also have very regular contact with the specialist clerk to the Committee on Criminal Justice too. So yes, there are close relationships between that committee and the wider sector.
Thank you. Okay, so I think Piers Barber had put a question in. We're coming up for the last 5 minutes, so I don't know if you're still there, Piers, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi guys. Hi Mark, thanks. That was really interesting. I work with 2 former graduates of the PRT, and Jenny Talbot and Juliet Lyon with the Independent Advisory Forum on deaths in custody. So we think about a lot of these issues a lot. My question's a bit existential, I suppose. It's sort of about prioritization and scale and that sort of thing. So you mentioned right at the top of your presentation about how a lot of the challenges you face from a third sector perspective about influencing, by which I mean sort of the penal populism idea, social views, money, funding, all that sort of stuff, are also really relevant to the people you're often trying to influence. So I'm thinking specifically of the MOJ ministers, but also senior team at HMPPS and specifically people within the prison system. And in fact, we often come across, and Jenny will be able to tell you about this, that a lot of the issues come elsewhere. So the most influential people are in HMT, in the Treasury, or in Number 10, or sometimes in DH, Department of Health, sorry. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on how PRT tries to get that balance right and work out where to focus your energy on some of these issues that often fall outside of the most immediately obvious sort of decision makers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. It's a really important point. I mean, prioritization is a constant challenge, I would say, as in, you know, what do you prioritize, and how do you reach a sort of decision on what to prioritize? You know, these are things we wrestle with all the time. We have a strategic plan, which we developed through consultation with, you know, not just ourselves, but with prisoners, with the wider sector, with people in government too, sort of behind, informally anyway. And that strategic plan guides our prioritization. You know, the plan itself is focused on long sentences because that's where we consider the drive in the population to be. But there's a challenge there because, I mean, that plan was formulated in 2018, and we're now in 2021, where there's a different government who are committed to a very different set of policies to the previous government. And as you say, the people making the decisions on the headline measures are not really in the MOJ, they're in Number 10 because they have a manifesto to deliver on. And, you know, those commitments were around longer sentences for serious offenders, mainly. In all honesty, they're extremely difficult to get to. You know, we know they are the decision makers in Number 10 who are deciding a lot of this stuff, but they are hard to access. So it's a challenge and we do our best, but they're not always easy to get meetings with, etc., or to get evidence into. Where we have a lot more success is in the ministry. You know, we know the Secretary of State, we know the officials, we know we know the junior ministers, and they, you know, they do have autonomy within the envelope set by Number 10. So, you know, if you look at the white paper, you will see it's a rather odd document made up of headline measures which were produced in, you know, in Number 10 through the manifesto, and then a lot more technical issues around community supervision, etc., which you can see have come from the ministry. I think it depends upon what policy you're looking to influence on. Again, you know, a lot of the stuff around, you know, some of it won't be on Number 10's radar, but the issue of the IPP inevitably will. Ultimately, you know, even someone like Robert Buckland may decide that there needs to be reform on this issue, but if you can't get it past Number 10, it's not going to happen. So inevitably, part of our strategy will be thinking about how on earth do we get to those decision makers in Number 10. But it's not easy. I mean, I won't pretend it's, you know, these are people who, you know, the gatekeeping to these people is formidable. So how you get to them is a challenge.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I think we have utilised every single second and minute of our hour and a half because we're now at 11:30. So I just wanted to say such a massive thank you, Mark, for it was a brilliant presentation, and I think that everyone has found it really illuminating and really interesting. So thank you. And thank you everyone for all your questions as well. Really interesting. I think we're just going to have a poll that pops up. So before you leave, it would be really grateful again if you could just complete that. So yeah, as I mentioned, there are going to be further events coming up. So if you've enjoyed this one, like, yeah, please do get involved. And also if you want to reach out to me, some of the smaller or more specialist organisations, I'd definitely like to start building relationships with you as part of the project to see what your needs are, and how we can kind of best shape the provisions that we're going to be conducting over the next 2 years. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you again, and I think that's it. So have a great rest of your day and week, and see you all again soon.